Sometimes real life crosses a line that fiction rarely dares to approach. There are moments when the truth becomes so disturbing, so incomprehensible, that it feels unreal. And today, you're about to hear 3 true stories that do exactly that. Stories that linger in your mind long after they end. Let's start with the first. Early in the morning on February 20th, 1881, a single police officer led a small group of men into the dense woods of Hill County, Texas. At the time, this was a remote farming area, quiet and isolated, surrounded by vast stretches of untouched wilderness. The forest here was thick, wild, and unforgiving, the kind of place where sound disappears and direction quickly loses meaning. They were searching for a man named George Arnold. George was a father of 7, a family man, a familiar face in the community, and 2 days earlier, he had vanished without a trace. The day George disappeared was a Sunday, and that detail mattered. Every Sunday, without fail, George attended church with his wife and children. It wasn't just routine, it was tradition, something he never broke. But that morning, something was different. Without explanation, George told his family he would stay home. He said he didn't feel like going. Those words alone unsettled them, because this was not like him at all. Still, his wife and children left for church, believing he would be there when they returned. When they came back, the house was silent. George was gone. There were no overturned chairs, no broken doors, no signs of a struggle. Everything looked exactly as it should have. The only indication that George had left at all was a letter he had written to his wife. In it, he said he had gone into the woods, and more importantly, he warned her not to follow him. 2 days later, those words weighed heavily on the minds of the men now searching for him. The officer and the search party moved deeper into the forest near George's home, far beyond any familiar path. Branches scraped against them. The ground was uneven and difficult. It felt like the woods themselves were closing in. Eventually, after hours of searching, they stepped into a clearing. It was wide, quiet, still. And standing in the center of it was a massive, towering tree. At the base of that tree sat George. Before they even reached him, they knew. He was dead. But what struck them first wasn't grief or shock. It was confusion, a deep, unsettling confusion that tightened in their chests as they got closer. Nothing about the scene made sense. George's ankle was secured to the tree with a thick iron chain. A heavy padlock held it in place, leaving no obvious way for him to escape. His body was completely naked. Nearby, his clothing lay in a torn, shredded pile, as if it had been ripped apart rather than removed. And then there were the wounds. George's skin was covered in deep scratches, cuts, and marks that immediately caught the officer's attention. At first glance, they resembled bite marks, but not the kind made by animals. These marks had come from a human mouth. Before any of this could be understood, there was one crucial detail in George's letter that now took on a far darker meaning. He hadn't written that he wanted to go into the woods. He had written that he had to. The letter ended with words of love for his family, with regret, with sorrow. He admitted he wished there were another way, but he said he had thought about it carefully, and that this was the only choice he had left. The marks were not left by an animal. They were left by a human mouth. As the officers carefully examined the ground surrounding George's body, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over them. Scattered among the torn, ruined remains of his clothing were dozens of small, pale objects pressed into the dirt and leaves. At first, none of them spoke. From a distance, the objects looked almost ordinary, like smooth white pebbles washed up by rain and forgotten by time. But the longer they stared, the more wrong it felt, and when one of the officers crouched down to look closer, the truth hit them with full force. These were not stones. They were teeth. George's teeth. Broken, splintered, and scattered around him as silent evidence of unimaginable suffering. The realization alone was enough to turn their stomachs, but the scene only grew worse as their attention shifted to the massive tree George had been leaning against. Its bark was shredded and torn open, carved with deep, uneven gouges that ran across the trunk at face level. This was not damage caused by tools, weather, or wild animals. It looked deliberate, intimate, and desperate. The markings told a horrifying story of a man pressing his face into solid wood and biting again and again, long past the point of pain, long past the point where instinct would normally force someone to stop. The grooves were the result of teeth breaking under pressure, of jaw muscles clenching in agony, of a human being locked in a battle with something far more terrifying than anything visible. And that was exactly what George had been doing. As if the shattered teeth were not disturbing enough, the officers noticed something else mixed into the dirt near the base of the tree. Fingernails. Several of them. George's fingers had been dragged violently across the bark, over and over, with such frantic force that his nails had been torn clean from his hands. The tree bore the unmistakable scars of a man clawing at it in desperation, as though he were trying to escape his own body, or tear himself free from whatever unseen nightmare had taken hold of him. The men stood in stunned silence, struggling to process what they were witnessing. Every wound, every mark, every horrifying detail pointed to the same conclusion. No one had done this to George. He had done this to himself. But that only raised a question that none of them wanted to answer. What could possibly drive a man to inflict this kind of suffering upon himself? What terror could be so overwhelming that it erased every instinct for self-preservation? The answer lay in something that had happened to George not long before he disappeared. George had been bitten by a dog. A dog carrying rabies. Today, a bite like that is terrifying, but it is survivable. Modern medicine offers treatment, vaccines, and hope. People recover, and life continues. But in the year 1881, none of that existed. There was no cure, no treatment, no chance of survival. Contracting rabies was not a question of if you would die, but how and when. As the disease began to take hold, George's body would have started to betray him. Fever would rise, his thoughts would become clouded, irritability and confusion would set in, followed by terrifying hallucinations that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. George understood exactly what was happening to him. He recognized the symptoms. He knew what the disease would eventually turn him into, a violent, uncontrollable danger to everyone around him. And that knowledge terrified him, not for his own sake, but for the sake of his wife and children. George was a deeply religious man. Taking his own life was something he believed he could never do. It was a line he could not cross. But the thought of harming his family, even unintentionally, was far worse. Faced with an impossible choice, George made a decision that he believed was the only moral option left to him. He wrote a letter to his wife, filling it with love, regret, and apology. He explained that he had no other choice, that this was something he had to do, even though it broke his heart. Then he walked into the woods alone, far from anyone he could hurt. He chained himself to a tree, locking himself in place, and resigned himself to what was coming. What followed was beyond anything most people could endure. A slow descent into agony as his mind unraveled and his body burned with pain. Terror, confusion, and suffering layered on top of one another until instinct and reason were gone. Pain so overwhelming that he bit into solid wood until his teeth shattered. Fear so consuming that he clawed at the bark until his nails were ripped free. Every moment stretched into unbearable torment. George's death was slow. It was brutal. It was inhuman. But he endured all of it for one reason, and one reason alone: to protect his family. When life finally returned to something that looked like normal, those destructive habits did not simply vanish. They lingered, quietly embedding themselves into daily routines, resurfacing at the worst possible moments. With time, a familiar and exhausting question began repeating itself in the mind, looping endlessly with no clear answer in sight. What is wrong with me, and why can't I stop doing this? The question carried weight, frustration, and shame, growing heavier each time it went unanswered. The truth is, these cycles are not random, and they are never meaningless. They don't appear without reason, and they don't sustain themselves by accident. Patterns like these are usually rooted in unresolved struggles buried deep beneath the surface, experiences that were never fully processed, emotions that were ignored, and truths that were never spoken out loud. When those things remain unaddressed, the cycle doesn't fade. It tightens, repeating itself again and again, quietly shaping behavior while convincing the person trapped inside it that the problem is personal failure rather than unresolved pain. But now, it's time to turn our attention elsewhere. There is one individual in history whose name has become inseparable from horror itself, so deeply intertwined with fear and violence that it has evolved into a symbol of pure evil. This person committed some of the most disturbing acts the world has ever witnessed, crimes so brutal that they still haunt history more than a century later. What makes it even more unsettling is the haunting possibility that these known atrocities may represent only a fraction of what truly occurred. And the reason for that uncertainty is simple. This person was never caught. Even more disturbing is the silence that followed. There was no confession, no explanation, no justification, no manifesto, no attempt to be understood. There was almost no communication with authorities, investigators, or the public at all. Just an empty void where answers should have been, leaving behind fear, speculation, and unanswered questions. Except for one moment, one brief, deliberate interaction. An exchange so disturbing that it would later become known by a name that still sends a chill through history. From hell. On the evening of October 12th, 1888, a 49-year-old businessman named George Lusk arrived home at his carefully kept residence in East London. The day had been unremarkable, and nothing suggested that his life was about to change forever. As usual, his housekeeper had arranged the day's mail neatly on a small table near the entrance. George picked it up absent-mindedly, flipping through the envelopes one by one. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Letters from friends, invitations to upcoming social events, familiar handwriting, predictable routines, nothing that demanded concern. Then he reached the bottom of the pile, and he stopped. Resting beneath the ordinary mail was a postcard and a letter that felt instantly different. Over the previous 2 months, 4 people had been brutally murdered within George's neighborhood. Fear had already taken hold of the area, and the most recent victim, a middle-aged woman, had been killed only 2 weeks earlier, shockingly close to George's own home. What made George's blood run cold was not just the presence of the letter, it was the name written on it. Displayed plainly as the return sender on both pieces of mail was the name of the still uncaptured killer, the very figure terrorizing the streets around him, now reaching directly into his home. George was living in a constant state of fear, and it was not paranoia, it was survival. The terror gripping the neighborhood had become so overwhelming that George felt compelled to act, to do something rather than sit helplessly and wait for the next body to be found. That fear drove him to help organize a neighborhood watch, a loose group of frightened residents patrolling the streets at night, clinging to the fragile hope that visibility alone might scare the killer away. Everyone in the area felt it. Doors were locked earlier, windows stayed shut. Every unfamiliar sound felt threatening. Not long before the letters arrived, George had been standing near the front window of his home, absent-mindedly scanning the street outside. He wasn't on patrol. He wasn't even looking for anything in particular. It was the kind of quiet moment where fear slowly creeps in when nothing distracts you from it. That's when he noticed a man standing across the road, partially concealed near a narrow alleyway. The man had a thick, heavy beard and an unsettling stillness about him. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was simply standing there, staring directly at George's house. At first, George stared back, trying to convince himself it meant nothing. But the longer the man remained motionless, the stronger the feeling grew in his chest. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. A wave of dread washed over him, cold and suffocating. Slowly, carefully, George reached out and pulled the blinds shut, retreating from the window as though being seen might somehow invite danger inside. A killer was roaming the streets, and in George's mind, that man outside could very well have been him. The encounter rattled George to his core. He couldn't shake the image, and he couldn't dismiss the feeling it left behind. So he went to the police and filed a report, explaining what he had seen and openly admitting his fear that the man might be the murderer everyone was searching for. But fear alone was not evidence. The police had nothing solid to act on, only a vague description of a man standing in the street, doing nothing overtly illegal. And so, nothing was done. Still shaken, George eventually opened the postcard and letter that had arrived at his home. What he read was far worse than anything he'd imagined. Whether the sender was truly the killer or someone cruelly pretending to be, the tone of the message was unmistakable. It was mocking, taunting. It made it clear that the writer knew about the neighborhood watch, knew about George's involvement, and dismissed it as meaningless. The message carried a chilling confidence. "I know what you're trying to do. I don't care. I can do whatever I want." The letter went even further, promising that 2 more people would be killed the very next night, and making it clear that there was nothing George, the neighborhood watch, or the police could do to stop it. George didn't waste a second. He gathered the letter and postcard and rushed out of his house, running straight to the police station. Breathless and shaking, he placed the messages in front of the officers and insisted they were real. He pleaded with them to take action, warning that lives were about to be lost. The police examined the letters carefully. They agreed that the tone was disturbing, even convincing. But they also knew how easily fear could be exploited. There was no definitive proof. It could have been an elaborate hoax. And even if it wasn't, they faced an impossible dilemma. They had no idea who the intended victims were or how to protect people they couldn't identify. With no clear path forward, George was told to return home, stay inside, and allow the authorities to handle the situation. The days that followed were unbearable. George lived in a state of constant dread, bracing himself for the news that another body had been discovered somewhere nearby. Every knock at the door made his heart race. Every sound outside made him tense. But nothing happened. No murders were reported, no headlines appeared. The streets remained quiet. Slowly, reluctantly, George began to convince himself that he had overreacted. Maybe the letters were fake. Maybe someone had been playing a sick and twisted joke, feeding on the fear already gripping the neighborhood. Then, on October 16th, 4 days after receiving the original messages, George returned home once again. As usual, his housekeeper had placed the mail neatly on the table just inside the entrance. But this time something was different. Resting on top of the envelopes was a small package, wrapped in plain brown paper. George's heart began to pound as he picked it up. Slowly, carefully, with growing dread, he started to unwrap it. Inside the package, lying directly on top, was a letter, and written across it were 2 words that instantly drained the color from his face. From hell. The middle-aged woman who had been brutally murdered just weeks earlier near George's home was soon confirmed to be another victim of the same unknown serial killer who had been terrorizing the area. Investigators were already convinced her death fit the same horrifying pattern. But as they examined her body more closely, they realized there was something deeply unsettling that set this crime apart even further. Something was missing. One of her kidneys. That detail alone sent a chill through everyone involved in the case. But what happened next pushed the horror to an entirely different level. Inside the small brown package George had just unwrapped was half of a human kidney, preserved and deliberately placed inside the box. The letter that accompanied it explained everything with cold, calculated clarity. The sender claimed that this organ belonged to the murdered woman and that what George was holding was only half of it. According to the message, the other half had already been consumed by the killer himself. This remaining portion, the letter stated, was not evidence, not a mistake, and not an accident. It was a gift. A personal offering meant specifically for George. Even now, more than a century later, many experts believe that these letters and the package containing that kidney may be the only truly authentic communications ever sent by Jack the Ripper. Everything else may have been imitation, rumor, or fabrication, but this moment stands apart as something chillingly real. Now, let's move forward in time. It was around 7 in the evening on May 21st, 1985, when a 17-year-old boy named Jason Finley sat quietly on the edge of his bed. He was staying in his grandmother's spare bedroom in the quiet suburban town of Scotch Plains, New Jersey. The house was calm, almost too quiet, the kind of stillness that settles in after hours of heavy rain. Jason took a slow breath, trying to steady his nerves, then reached for the landline phone resting beside him. With careful, deliberate movements, he dialed the number of the girl he had been seeing for the past few weeks. Her name was Kathy. Jason liked her a lot. More than a lot, actually. And that night, after days of hesitation and self-doubt, he had finally built up the courage to ask her to be his girlfriend. As the phone rang, Jason stared out the window at the violent thunderstorm raging outside. Rain had been pouring non-stop all day, trapping Jason, his twin cousins, and his grandmother inside the house since morning, with no escape from each other or the restless energy that builds when young people are stuck indoors too long. Earlier that week, Jason had admitted to his cousins that he wanted to call Kathy and make things official. They had immediately jumped on him for it, mocking him relentlessly, turning his nerves into a running joke. So stepping away into the spare bedroom to make this call felt like his first real moment of peace all day. A small pocket of quiet where he could finally focus. Then Kathy answered. The moment Jason heard her voice, everything else vanished. The teasing, the noise, the frustration of the day all faded into the background. His heart began to race as he felt a sudden surge of courage rise up inside him. He wanted to say it immediately. He wanted to blurt it out before his nerves could catch up with him. He took a breath, gathering himself, preparing to finally ask the question he had rehearsed in his head over and over again. And then, just before the words could leave his mouth, an explosive, searing pain tore through the back of his head. It was instant, violent, overwhelming, and then everything went black. At that exact moment, down the hallway in the kitchen, Jason's grandmother had just finished making dinner. She called out for Jason and the twins, asking them to come help set the table. The twins responded and came into the kitchen, but Jason didn't answer. A few seconds passed, then a few more. Growing impatient, his grandmother told the twins to go check on him and bring him in for dinner. They walked down the hallway toward the spare bedroom. Seconds later, the house was filled with screaming. Jason's grandmother rushed toward the sound, her heart pounding as she reached the doorway. Inside the room, she saw the twins standing frozen beside the bed, unable to move. Jason was slumped forward, completely still, the phone receiver still pressed against his ear as if he were in the middle of a conversation. At first glance, it looked like he had simply fallen asleep, but he wasn't moving. And something was terribly, terribly wrong. At first, Jason looked like he was simply asleep, slumped forward in a way that almost felt peaceful. But when they shook him, when they called his name louder and louder, there was no response, no movement, no sound. Panic swept through the room in an instant. His grandmother's hands trembled as she grabbed the phone and urgently called emergency services, her voice breaking as she tried to explain that something was terribly wrong. The ambulance arrived quickly, its lights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness outside. Paramedics rushed into the house, their movements fast and precise, lifting Jason onto a stretcher and carrying him out as quickly as they could. He was rushed straight to the hospital, every second feeling like it might matter. But it didn't. By the time they arrived, Jason was pronounced dead. He was only 17 years old, young, active, and completely healthy. When doctors examined him, they were stunned by what they didn't find. There were no visible injuries, no signs of illness. No medical explanation that made sense. After exhausting every immediate possibility, they delivered the only answer they had to Jason's shattered family. They didn't know what happened. He had simply died. That explanation was impossible to accept. Jason's family refused to let it end there. They pushed for a deeper investigation, demanding a full forensic examination, unwilling to believe that a healthy teenage boy could just collapse and die without reason. And it was during this much more thorough autopsy that the case took an unexpected and unsettling turn. At first, the findings matched what the doctors had already concluded. There was no obvious cause of death. And as disturbing as it is, it's true that sometimes even healthy people die suddenly, without warning. But the forensic investigator continued digging, carefully examining every detail, unwilling to settle for an unanswered question. That's when they found something the hospital had missed. Jason's eardrum had ruptured. On its own, that discovery didn't immediately solve anything. It wasn't a clear answer, and it didn't explain why Jason had died. But as the investigator reviewed the timeline of events and considered every factor surrounding Jason's final moments, another detail became impossible to ignore. The weather. At the exact time Jason collapsed, a powerful thunderstorm had been raging outside the house. Lightning had been striking nearby, and when that information was paired with the ruptured eardrum, the truth finally emerged. While Jason was on the phone talking to Kathy, lightning struck the phone line outside the house. The electrical surge traveled through the line, surged through the phone, and passed directly into Jason's head. The shock was instantaneous. Jason never felt it coming. He never had time to react. He was killed instantly. Later, Kathy would reflect on that call and say she could sense what Jason was about to say. She could hear it in his voice, in the way he hesitated, in the breath he took just before everything went silent. She knew he was finally about to ask her to be his girlfriend, and she said that if he had asked, she would have said yes. If these stories stayed with you, if they pulled you in and made you feel something deep, don't let that feeling fade away. Stay connected. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which part of this story stayed with you the longest, because your voice matters, and I read every single comment.